Hello, my name is Randy Reid. I'm the Executive Director of the National Lighting Bureau, as well as the editor and publisher of the Edison Report, which is delighted to co-sponsor the NLB's annual Lighting Forum. We are here at the studio's other co-sponsor, the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, where I am moderating 5 panel discussions. This panel is titled Lighting and the Future of Food, Cannabis, and Other Crops. Our panelists are Greg Berry from iLighting and Neil Yorio from Bios Lighting. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you.
First question goes to you, Neil. Tell us about the horticulture market and how it's defined.
We define the horticultural market as the market with which we are using electrical lighting sources for either supplementing greenhouses or sole source lighting applications.
Okay, how big is the market?
Currently, the market's about $2.5 billion worldwide, and it's projected to grow to around $6 billion in 2023, and as high as $10 to $20 billion by 2026.
Wow. And what percent of this market is food? What percent is cannabis?
Yeah, we look at it just a little bit different. We have a difficult time because in this industry, there is not a lot of information. We look at it as the same way Neil does, is that it's lit and non-lit. We only care about the lit part of it, which is mostly greenhouses and stuff like that. We look at a square foot basis. So we're looking at about 3 billion square feet on a worldwide basis. And Europe represents about 70% of that. The U.S. only represents about 10% of that, about 300 million square feet.
Why?
The need for food and the agricultural and the space is just so much larger in Europe. They're significantly farther ahead of us, the population and everything else. You got to remember, we got roughly 7.7 billion people in the U.S. Based on the next 10 years, based on the growth we've had, we're going to have over 10 billion people. We got a food problem.
You said 7 billion people in the U.S.?
No, in the world. In the world today,
okay.
we got about 7.7 billion people.
Right.
And when we're going to grow to over 10 billion worth over in the next 10 years. So the reality is that we got to have a way of feeding all those people. So the reality is that we got to try to figure out how to do that. So we figure out that the U.S. market's about 300 million. Of that 300 million, about 50% of that is fruits and vegetables.
And again, 300 million square feet.
Square feet. Mm-hmm.
All right.
300 million of the square footage, indoor lit square footage, is fruits and vegetables. About 45% of that is flowers for ornaments type of things. And then only about 10% of that is cannabis, or 5% is cannabis and vertical marking and vertical farming, which is relatively new. So that's how we define it. So really, when you talk about cannabis, you talk about vertical farming, it really only represents about 5% of the total farming. However, it's about 50% growth. And if you take a look at, you take it down just a little step further, is that when you take a look at the light source, that HID is still about 90%, 95% of the lighting. And LED is about 5%, and then you look at another 5%, which is a hybrid.
Right.
So it's very small.
I want to come back to those sources.
Yeah.
But tell us a little bit about the customer. Who is the customer for horticulture?
We look at the customer base as being either the grower itself, the investor in a grow facility, or the facility manager of a grow facility. So typically those are our 3 targets when we're focusing on who the customer is.
And that's an interesting thing. We take it down a little step further. We believe that the customer is the plant. We believe that the reality is that the plant has to have certain criteria, it has to have certain performance to grow. It doesn't really matter if you're a crummy grower and you can't, and then it doesn't really matter, right? So the reality is that we figure out the plant is the customer. We want to do what's right for the plant. The reality is Neil knows, the fact is that every single variety of plant has a different formula for growth. There isn't just one lamp you can put out there that's going to
grow light.
There's not a grow light. Remember the old Agri-Grow?
Sure.
When all they really did was they painted a fluorescent green 25 years ago and made billions of dollars. Okay, well that all that had was UV in it. It was just a fluorescent tube with UV in it. That's all it really truly was. So it's not just one source. So we look at it that way. There are channels of distribution, as Neil described, but the reality is we look at the plant, the actual plant as the customer.
So let's talk about that plant, and if I may be specific, I'm a home gardener.
Yeah.
And I start my tomato plants in January. I used to use metal halide.
Yeah.
And my plants would grow great, and they would get to a point, they would start to flower, and they would just die if I didn't get them outside soon enough. And I was always told that's because I didn't have enough red or infrared. Is that true?
I think that, well, to emphasize a point that Greg just made, there is no magic spectrum. And one thing that is generally a revelation to a lot of people in this emerging market of horticultural lighting, particularly with regard to LED, is that there is no magic spectrum. And so people think that they're going to get something out of the box that's going to provide something that is which is, they're going to get something out of the box that's not going to live up to their expectations. So in the case of growing plants under an electric light and then bringing it outside, a lot of times the light technology is blamed for the failure. And as Greg pointed out earlier, the plant being the customer, you need to provide what the plant needs in its basic needs in order to get a successful result in the plant. In your particular example, where you said that you had a declining plant or a failure toward the end of its growth cycle, probably had something to do with other environmental factors other than the light itself.
Okay,
Yeah.
good to know.
I'd agree with that.
So I hear,
But I do want to
please.
point out. I do want to point out that there is far red is very, very important. We know that, and there's not enough expertise in this industry. We all go by, you know, McCree curve, and we go by par values, and we try to analyze it in our own terms when we're not looking at it from the plant perspective. The plant needs a full spectrum going down from UV to 300 to over 800. And we only categorize it from 400 to 700. So we're putting it in a very small box. The reality is that plant needs UV when it starts, and it needs far red when it finishes. We've seen a lot of different, evidence towards that. And so that's where our belief is that we have to have the plant really needs a full spectrum. And it's just not one lamp source that can do all that. Sometimes in growers we're doing today are more of a hybrid, where they'll start out with UV or they'll start out with LED and they'll finish with HID, depending upon how
Interesting. I hear a great combination today is metal halide and high pressure sodium, because they can get the reds and I guess the far reds from high pressure sodium. Is that true?
Well, not all far reds, but yeah, but every lamp manufacturer is different, and that's where the problem is, because everybody's got a claim out there. It's kind of like the Wild West, and go back to the old LED days and the CNI, which is, it's got cleaned up a lot from the CNI part of it. Everybody had their own claims. Today we still talk about, a million hours. So LED lasts a million hours when the driver only lasts 30,000 hours, and vice versa and stuff like that. The reality is everybody's got their own claims. Everybody's trying to fit within, again, a box. We have to take a look at the full spectrum, and you got to really take a look at the graphs of companies to find out who's really doing that. And LED is no different. We got to do the same thing with LEDs. We got to figure that part of it out.
All right, a couple of terms. You mentioned McCree curve.
Yeah.
Explain to our audience what the McCree curve is.
The McCree curve is it's based on research done in the early 1970s by a researcher named Keith McCree, and he studied about 17 different types of plants, both in a greenhouse and outdoor lighting situation. And what he did was he studied the photosynthetic rate of plants at various wavelengths across the photobiological active range that plants see. And so he was able to publish a paper that showed that it's very conserved. The photobiological response of plants is highly conserved among many different species of plants. And so what that McCree curve shows is that there is a range of light that is being used for photosynthesis roughly between 400 and 700 nanometers, as Greg pointed out, but it does extend down into the UV range as well as the far red range. And so that has helped define what the photosynthetically active radiation definition is, which is between 400 and 700 nanometers. Now, what the McCree curve does show is that there tends to be a peak in the blue area of the spectrum and a peak in the red area of the spectrum, with a shallow valley in the green area of the spectrum. And so that's why plants appear green to us, is because they do absorb green light, roughly 60 to 70% of the green light, but they absorb more blue and red light than green, and that's why plants appear green to us.
And is that why when I see pictures of greenhouses, I see a purple light?
Right.
Because they're not giving it the green.
Well, that is actually based on somewhat of a misinterpretation of science. So people can isolate chlorophyll, which is which is the major light-absorbing pigment in plants. And if you look at isolated chlorophyll molecules in a test tube in a if you look at chlorophyll molecules isolated in a solvent from a plant in a spectrophotometer, and you expose it to various wavelengths of light, you'll see that those chlorophyll molecules absorb light in the blue and the red range. And so people take that as the guidance, if you will, to design a grow light to be purple, meaning combining blue and red light together and ignoring the other wavelengths of light that are very important for plant growth, as Greg pointed out. A full spectrum is necessary for supplying all of the other photobiological or light-absorbing pigments in plants to stimulate all of those responses.
Yeah, there's another study that was done. It's called the Emerson effect, and the Emerson effect really shows the value of the far reds that the McCree curve didn't really do. So the reality is that there's beyond that. So we have to make sure that when we talk about spectrum, that we expand the curve. And there's a lot of work being done on that to challenge the McCree curve. There's several different companies out there today that are doing it. But I think that the true people and the true biologists and the true PhDs really believe that we got to expand that. We've talked to a lot of different professors at universities and stuff like that that agree with that philosophy, such as the Ohio State University and Stanford University and some other universities that we've talked to. So the reality is that we know that that's being challenged, and it has to be challenged.
So gentlemen, I'd like to pin you down on my tomato plants.
Yeah.
I'm going to start in January. I've been using plasma. I went from metal halide to plasma, and I'm having better results. What is the best technology I should use for my tomato plants from seed until I put them in the ground?
That's a tough question. That's a loaded question.
That is a loaded question.
That is
a loaded one.
So I want to answer that by prefacing it by saying that a lot of people, they define a grow light as something that's providing light for plants to grow. It's the energy source, and it's also a signaling source for the plants. And it's not very well known that no electric lighting technology developed today has ever been developed for plants, including LEDs. And they were all developed for human lighting applications. It just so happens that plants and people are sensitive or react to the same roughly the same wavelength range. And so when you're talking about providing a broad spectrum or a wide spectrum of light for plants, plasma provides a very nice broad spectrum, though it's not very energy efficient. Right. You can talk about other types of technologies. You mentioned earlier about metal halide and high pressure sodium being combined together. The reason why people combine those two types of lights together is because the metal halide provides a blue rich spectrum and the high pressure sodium provides a red or orange rich spectrum. The combination of those two, since both of them are lacking a significant amount of radiation to make it a true broad spectrum source, combining the two types of technologies compensates for the lack that either has.
Okay.
And I think that's a great answer and kind of sidestep your question, because I would do the same thing, but because there is no exact answer. But I will add this. Lighting is just one portion of the environment, okay, in a greenhouse. You've got CO2, you've got, you've got heat, you've got all those different things of environment. The reason why you go to an in-house or a greenhouse is you want to control that environment. You can't control the weather outside, but you can control the indoor. That's why the growth of greenhouses is becoming larger and larger, because we got to feed those 10 billion people, right? So the reality is that we have to have more greenhouses where we can control the environment. However, you have to think about the components in that. As you switch sources, and one of the things that HID does give you is the heat, okay? Now, if you go to an LED source, which is cooler, then you've got to balance your other factors, heat being one of them. And i.e., what's the most inefficient thing that you can have is run a heater, right? So the reality is that you're going to be trading one for another, but you've got to control the entire environment. And I think that's the critical part of it. It's just not a matter of switching out light sources. We believe LED is going to be the future of lighting as well. But it's the matter of how you control the environment that within that facility that controls and determines the performance of your growth.
Tell our audience a little bit about vertical farming.
Vertical farming is a relatively new approach to farming in which you increase significantly the volume efficiency of a grow facility. So in other words, instead of having a single level and a large footprint, you can stack and tier various levels of growing so that you can have a smaller space with vertical tiers to maximize the volume efficiency, and the canopy area within that facility.
It represents about 3% of the market today, but it's probably the fastest growing segment of the market because you can, and 95% of it is LED, by the way, because you're
Is
basically LED.
Okay.
The light source is LED.
Why?
Because you're using trays. You're basically stacking them all up. And you could have a ceiling as high as 50 feet in, I think, New Jersey facilities, 50, 75 feet. That's just basically stacked. And so you're using LED that are in the tray. So you're growing primary lettuce. LED especially likes lettuce because it's not as hardy of a plant, and it grows better under LED than some of the other varieties. So the reality is that it's a great food source to be able to grow lettuce, to be able to experiment with tomatoes and everything else. The other part of it that's so exciting about vertical farming is the fact is that grocery stores can actually grow their own vegetables in a container in the back.
Right.
So you could actually lock it up, turn it on, and you could actually grow your own lettuce. You could grow your own vegetables where you could have farm to market that would be relatively short. So that's really the goal, I think, of vertical farming, is that you may start out having national type of things, but you're going to have regional, and then you're going to start having where it's going to be very local. I know at this one of the stores that I shop at in North or South Carolina, they actually have a little growing center where they actually grow herbs. And they got a little light, they grow their own herbs, you chip it all, you cut it all off and put it in a bag, and they charge you on the way to the bag. And so that's fresh as you can get.
Sure.
And that's where vertical farming is kind of going, in my opinion, is the fact is that you're going to be able to do that farm to market, get that freshness, you're going to pay more for it, but you're going to be willing to pay for it.
Okay, so that's it, pay more for it. So on the container behind the grocery store, very efficient to be so close, but the cost would be higher than traditional?
You'd be higher than traditional, but we're finding that people, again, go to any farm market in any city across the U.S. Today, you can't get in the place.
Right.
Cleveland, Saturday and Sunday, you cannot get into the farmer's market because people are buying fresh fruit, fresh vegetables. You call them millenniums, you want to call them whatever you want. The reality is that people in general are buying fresh fruits and fresh meats and farm to market. That's the biggest thing. They want to be able to have that. We truly believe the way we look at the market is that we see this, we call urban gardening.
Right.
An urban gardener. We used to call them hobbyists, people that used to just kind of grow for the hobby, like you're a hobbyist.
Right.
We actually think that there's going to be this gigantic market called urban gardens, because we know that 60% of the population by 2050 is going to live in urban areas, right? So they're going to need places to be able to grow their own fruits and vegetables. So we're going to see where people are actually going to set up their own little stands and stuff like that and grow their own fresh vegetables, and combine that with some of the farm to market stuff where it's more localized. So we kind of see that as the growing trend of people growing their own fruits and vegetables.
In Copenhagen, we saw a public farm where people have their little plot and they actually have fencing around it so people don't come and steal their vegetables. Of
course.
But I found that fascinating. Last question, the role of the DLC in horticulture lighting. Helpful?
Well, you Randy, I know quite a few, or I'm pretty intimate with DLC. I don't know if Neil is, but I can tell you my feelings on it. That DLC always played a good role. However, where the horticulture business is different than the C&I business. If you want to reduce energy, which is the utilities mandate, okay, in the C&I, just turn all the lights off. That's the easiest way, right? You can't do that when you grow plants.
Sure.
So you got to have the happy medium. So you've got to be able to figure out how do we set the rules of engagement and what are those, and how do we actually do the testing of it with not the utility in mind or the customer in mind, but really the true customer, which is the plant. How do we figure out how to maximize that? And how do we make sure that we put the rebate programs in that are appropriate? I don't believe that, in my opinion, I should say this. I believe, in my opinion, is that there's multiple light sources in the growth cycle. I believe there's a place for LED. I think there's a place for HID. I think there's a place for other types of lighting, plasma, whatever it may be. I think that variety is because each one has a different function. So I think that's where the place has got to go. I think we've got to be very careful not to go down too far down the DLC, and I think that they've learned from the C&I mistakes they made, which is good, but I think the reality is we have to figure out how to manage that from the customer's perspective, which again is the plant.
Okay.
Yeah, and I feel that the DLC is one of a number of certification types of groups that are looking at this new technology and this new application of lighting technology for plant growth applications. And so what it's doing is it's legitimizing a number of it's making a number of manufacturers legitimize their products to meet certain standards that the DLC would require, as would other certification agencies. And so it allows us to focus on the manufacturers that are producing very energy efficient, appropriate spectrum, appropriately designed for the application fixtures, and weeds out the manufacturers that are unable to meet those. So it's very good from a certification perspective that we have that type of limit or ability or definition of what the performance, at least the minimum performance of these technologies needs to be.
Closing thoughts, closing comments?
You know, I've been in the lighting business for over 35 years, and you know, same with you. I think that horticulture, especially horticultural lighting, is some of the most exciting times. You know, we've got a lot of potential as an industry. We got a lot of potential for future growth. We got a lot of potential from that standpoint. That I'm excited about this. I think that it's new, it's fun. It's a whole different world than commercial industrial lighting. It's a whole different industry. It's a whole different group of channels. It's some of the most complex things at times and some of the most simplistic things at times. But it's probably one of the most exciting things that I've done in my career, to tell you the honest truth. And I'm excited about the horticulture and the potential it has, because as I look at the need to feed 10 billion people to this world, the impact that we can have of growing indoors and providing the right light to the right customer, which is the plant, and achieving that objective of feeding 10 billion people in the next 10 years, I think is encouraging.
I would agree. Neil, closing comments?
Yes. Lighting technology is the #1 barrier for controlled environment crop production, and it has been historically, and it's what's led to a number of failures in the past about trying to get, or entities trying to create urban farms or controlled environment crop production that has been profitable, and a number of companies have failed in the past. My background has been on the research side of lighting and applications in controlled environment crop production. It's very exciting for me to see that type of research now being implemented in a marketplace and helping break down that significant barrier to create these types of urban farms and being able to create in a much more efficient manner and a more profitable way crops for our growing population.
All right, gentlemen, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Greg.
Appreciate it.
Thank
Thanks,
you, Neil.
Randy.